episode 423 of Retro Encounter, RPG Fans' weekly podcast of many topics. I'm Zach Wilkerson. I will be your host today. And we are back to talk about the second half of Grandia II, that 2000, I believe, RPG that came out for the Dreamcast originally. And I played it at least on my Nintendo Switch this most recent time. But before we get into talking about all the ways in which the church is bad in this game, let's go ahead and introduce our panel, starting with you, Ben.
Hey.
And Clayton.
Hey, good to be here again.
Yeah, nice to have both of you. And I was just listening to the first part, and I thought it turned out really well. You guys did a great job, so excited to talk about part two. So part two, it has some tonal shifts. We'll kind of talk about those from the first half. It becomes definitely more of the original Grandia as we go through it, in terms of the characterization and in terms of just, the way the characters perceive and handle things. But it's still a much darker game on the whole. But that kind of starts, I believe last time we left off, just sort of arriving at the papal state, or whatever they call it in this game, to meet with the Pope, or sort of the head of the Church of Granus, and to get some advice about what to do about millennia, and about all the different pieces of Valmar that we see. And when we first meet the guy, he seems like a pretty nice guy. He seems kind of thoughtful and like sorry to ask us to do things. And I think the first time I played this game, and I'm curious, Clayton, for you, how you saw it. I don't think, and I was young, I don't think that it even occurred to me that this dude was a bad guy. Playing it again, it's like so obvious. But what were some of your impressions, both of you, of sort of this whole sequence of events, and of Lord of Granus, or the head of the church?
Yeah, so I started because we'd met the what's her name?
Celine.
Celine, yeah. So we'd met Celine, and she just was immediately just obviously a villain. I'd sort of started to predict that the church isn't what it seems, and obviously just the history of video games taught me that the church is never what it seems. But and then I fully admit that once I met the Pope, I was like, oh, hang on, actually maybe there's two sects within the church, and they're gonna, it's gonna be about there's a class of people that are into Valmar, and there's some that are with Granus, and I was completely tricked by this dude, and I was like, nah, he's a good guy. We're gonna follow this dude, and we're gonna do what he says. Yeah, I'm a little bit embarrassed by it, to be honest, because I was like, no, I should have just stuck with my my original instinct.
No, I totally understand.
Well, they're clever because they have him admonish Celine for like her behavior in Marumu Village. And I think that is like, especially for a first time player, is like would make you think like, oh, maybe it's not going that way, because he like acknowledges that she was like overzealous, and you were kind of expecting like a fire and brimstone kind of guy, and he's very much not that. But I think like playing it again, it's the fact that he's like so like that he's not even really bothered by the fact that Elena has the wings of Valmar. I think is almost like a little bit of a clue, because like the teachings of the church, and like from everything that you've heard from all the members of the church when they talk about Valmar, like that it's such a big deal, and that's such like that's like having that curse is like such a tragedy, even if they wouldn't react how Celine would. But he's just like, oh, I actually need you to just go get me this powerful item. It's like, oh, like to me, like playing it the second time, it's like, oh, I see, like he has like a concern that's different than what the teachings of the church are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Like he's got access to more information about the duology of Valmar and Granus than others, and I guess again I just sort of internalized that and thought, oh yeah, I guess he knows more, and he thinks everything will be all right, and we just get this item and it'll be good.
Yeah, I agree. The second time through, I saw what Ben saw, but the first time I was completely fooled. And the second, I've played this 3 times now, so you could see the seeds of it, and I think it's clever. But I think that at the end of the sequence, you are asked to accompany Elena to go find the Grana Saber, which we hear is like this, sort of ancient sort of legend that was used to defeat Valmar a long time ago. And Elena's behavior, I think, is maybe the thing that maybe most tips me off. Like, 'cause she seems very like she seems upset, but she's very quiet, she's very withdrawn, and that gives us maybe some indication that something is going on here, that there is information that we are not being told, that turns out to be very true, later on.
I think
um
also she was waiting to get help from, someone at the
mhm,
Papal State, and she just didn't get that. And now she's,
mhm,
I don't know, maybe starting to feel like she is a bit of a pawn in a game.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like what she expected to happen didn't happen, and, like, the fact that she's even still alive, I think, is, like, part of that, because I think that she was kind of like, she's really apprehensive before she actually and she's trying to, like, delay meeting with the Pope, and then that priest comes and makes her go, like, in the middle of dinner or whatever, and so it's like, she had that anxiety that I think was more, like, about herself, but then after she talks to Zara, it's like it's almost like it's a different type of anxiety, right? Like that there's something that's bothering her now that's different from just, oh, I might, die from having this removed from me or whatever,
mm.
right? And that you can kind of sense that change in her, the way she interacts with the rest of the party and everything.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's a good way of putting it. So from there, we have to go, we have to go across the rift, and we have this long journey to take. But the first place we go, and please correct my pronunciation on this, is it Serum Kingdom? Is that right?
Uh, yeah,
Or
like
Kyrum? Yeah, I'm not
Sirum
sure.
or Serum, yeah.
Yeah, Sirum Kingdom. And there's a really, I think that it's a really interesting town and a really interesting sequence here, because it turns out that the people of this kingdom are known, sort of behind closed doors, as the people of darkness. They are descendants of people who fought for Valmar in the original war, but they are by no means, obviously evil people, or there's nothing, obviously wrong with them. But then very quickly as well, you discover that Roan, our not very annoying child character, is the prince of this kingdom as well. Um, and a lot of stuff happens there. You are, eventually, eventually have to go. Like, what's happening, I think, is the king is trying to open up like sort of this ancient gate that they've been protecting,
Mhm.
from darkness. And he's like, I want to open it so that we can become the people we're supposed to be. He opens it, and it turns out that it's just a weapons factory, of ancient weapons. And let me say this: I think the way they use technology in this game is weird. I never really got a feel for like where the technology came from or the history of it. Like, I know it was a big deal, but it's not now, and it's like, why isn't it anymore? And I think that there's a lot they could have done with the technology stuff that they don't do. But yeah, you also end up meeting your new party member, Tio, while you're down there as well. So there's a lot that goes on there, and I feel like I've kind of covered too much
I
and
think
talked too
going back
much.
to
So go ahead.
so going back to the technology, I think it's almost an implied either a dark age or like a society going back to basics. You learn more about the technology and its origin later in the story, and it's almost like a post-war bounce back where they go, we don't want to engage with that type of technology because the bulk of that technology is sort of, I mean, maybe it's not the right time to say this, but from off the planet almost. It's coming from outside.
Right, it's associated with Valmar, and because, like, Valmar is, and Valmar and his, like, followers are the ones that were defeated, so that's, like, the reason why the technology is more, kept under wraps and rejected, I think,
Mm. Yeah,
because they weren't the victors of the conflict, yeah.
yeah,
When you put it that way, it makes more sense to me. It didn't occur to me that like the reason they wouldn't want to embrace that technology. So yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. It's a representation of like the corruption of man.
I really like, the festival that goes on before, you kind of, start infiltrating the castle with Roan, because you get a little more, like, Millennia, Elena, kind of love triangle with Ryudo
Mhm.
stuff going on, which I think is just, like, a lot of fun. And there's like the carnival games that you can play with Elena, and then you can also play them with Millennia. And they have like different reactions and stuff to everything. Um,
It's around here
and
that Millennia sort of explicitly states that she's interested or in love with Ryudo too. So it sort of really starts to kick off that part of the story, the love triangle, like you said.
yeah, and it's just like a more, one of those like more lighter moments. You have the
Mm.
where you have to arm wrestle the guy.
Yeah,
Anybody figure out
um,
how to do that well? Because like I
no,
won because I cheated the first time or however that
well,
happened.
yeah, Elena. That always happens. Like Elena will just helps you. She like distracts him.
But apparently you can get like more items from continuing to arm wrestle, and I'm like, hey, I'm not going to do that because I have no idea how to make this work.
Yeah, it's hard because you have to like mash the A button and then use the trigger to like push back against the a guy's arm, but like you lose the power so fast, and like I couldn't like mash the button fast enough to get enough like stamina to do it.
yeah, I give up on this sort of stuff because it's like I play my Switch in bed and my wife's sleeping and I'm just absolutely mashing a button and it's all clicky and I'm like I don't want to wake my wife up because she's not going to understand why this is happening.
Yeah, but it is like it's a cute moment, and you get a little more like of the romantic tension between the all three of them, I guess,
Mm.
which is always a little was always fun.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is also where Melphis shows up, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He shows up and he's the one who kills the king, if my memory is correct on that front. And I think that Melphis immediately has like some of the most deliciously over the top voice
Yeah,
acting.
evil guy. Yeah.
It's so good, and his character design is so like late '90s villain that I just love Melphis. I think everything about Melphis is the parts of this game that I like the most. But we haven't talked about Tio either, who I think is reasonably well developed. Tio is a machine who was originally developed as a weapon of Valmar, and basically you convince her that she doesn't need to do that anymore, and Merrick is really the mentor figure to her throughout a lot of this game, sort of trying to teach her to like make her own decisions,
He
and
essentially adopts her and like
yeah.
becomes an
Yeah.
immediate father figure, and that I guess they just immediately shift into that relationship, which is interesting.
Well, and because
Um,
she's like, she's like waiting for orders, right? And
mm,
so she like he's like I guess I think he's like the first person to interact with her after they because she had the claws of Valmar implanted in her, right? And
yeah,
Melphis like did that and left her behind to like stall them.
yeah,
And then when they defeat her, everybody else is like ready to just leave her behind. And Mareg is like, no, we can't leave her behind. Like she's still like a creature, like a living creature. And then he like picks her up, and then she like wakes up and she like imprints on him
yeah.
basically.
Like when a duck comes out of the egg, just the first thing
Yeah.
it sees. Okay.
Yeah, and she like the way that they're programmed is that they just take commands from whoever they think their master is. But of course Mareg is like a very like free-spirited guy, right? So he's like, "No," he's like, you have to make your own decisions." And she's like, "I don't understand what that means." And so that's kind of their, he's like, "Well, I guess we can take," he's like, "Well, you can come with us then."
Yeah, I like this town specifically too because it like presents some culture. It's good that that there is a lot of little discrete cultures here, but this is it's obviously like a bit of a play on Venice and
Mhm.
maybe sort of like Western Europe, like far Western Europe, and yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's
And
very
like seeing it,
colorful.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. And having a
Yeah.
this player you've been walking around with suddenly become a king, sort of
Mhm.
overnight.
Yeah, and I think too it's like a I like this section because like so Melphis was kind of acting as like almost like a Jafar kind of figure where he's like whispering in the king's ear, and so it's like implied that he convinced the king to like open up the gate to the factory or whatever. And it's like the way he convinces him is like a nationalism, right? Like,
Mm,
oh, this is your people's history and your duty, and you actually should regain your pride, and you're supposed to be powerful. And I think that's like a really um, interesting contrast to like what we've previously seen Valmar kind of take advantage of the weakness of people, like prejudice or devotion to the church or things like that. And this is more like, it's bringing up something that's not really related to religion at all. It's more like your national identity and how that can be used um, to like get people to do evil things.
Yeah, and they represent that by like peeling off their current banner to reveal like the mark of Valma or the seal of Valma. I thought was a pretty cool moment.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought so too. And I think it's sort of that combined with the stuff with Tio, I think starts to crystallize some of the thematic concerns of this game.
Hmm.
Where, it's these people who are, absolutely devoted to this one thing, whether it's good or evil or nationalism or the orders you're taking from, your, master or whatever.
Mm.
And I think it starts to crystallize that, and I think it's the people of darkness concept is just really interesting to me.
Hmm.
I feel like it's very rare that we get to see like the people who followed the big bad, and really explore that, but also explore how that group had made choices that sort of went against who they were as people of darkness, and how they didn't need to be that necessarily. So I think it's one of the reasons I like this sequence so much too, because I think that outside of Melphis just being like dripping with cool, um, you get some of the thematic concerns I think of this game really starting to come into focus.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like questioning authority and like resisting authority, I think is like a big theme of this game. And this is like, authority can come from a lot of different places. And this is showing like it's not just like, oh, the church bad, like dogma of the church and doctrine of the church. It's also like, being beholden to the past or to this national identity or idea of what your country is supposed to be also.
Yeah, the idea develops throughout the game, but it really is about. It's not even about the church or a god. It's about belief and dogma. Like you say, it's about this blind following. And it starts to really talk about human autonomy. And I think Tio is a really good stand-in for that, like
Mhm.
human autonomy and free thought, making your own decisions and such. Yeah, there is. It actually is a bit of a turning point in the story, a real sort of crux.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first half of the game is carried, for me at least, by Ryudo's snark, and the second half is where like they start to get into some I think really interesting thematic ideas. Like this isn't
Mhm.
Disco Elysium or anything, but um it still has something to say. And it might say it too many times, but it has something to say, and I respect that. So after we leave there, sort of on our journey towards the Grana Saber, we so first of all we leave Roan behind. He's got to be king now, so bye Roan. And then we get Tio, who is easily the most broken character in this game. She has the ability to delay attacks, for like in a line, I think, right?
Yeah,
Um,
she's the only one who has a cancel ability that hits more than one person at once.
yeah,
So that's, yeah, really
and
strong.
especially against bosses where there's like
Mhm.
six different body parts like all
Right.
crouched together. She's so good and she's so fast, that she was taking like two turns for every the bosses every one for me sometimes. So yeah, she's fantastic in battle. um but After we leave there, we head to, I believe, what's called Garland Village, the original home of Ryudo. So we get to see the backstory of how Ryudo came to be who he is, and the backstory of Melphis. Um, and yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I was just gonna say the way they get there is really cool. Like they get on so Roan gives them a ship and the captain,
Oh
Captain
yeah,
Blakula, and
that
he's
guy's great.
like, yeah, and on the ship it's written 50/50. And they're like, oh, like what does that mean? Is this like one of 50 ships or like whatever? And he's like, oh, you'll understand later. And so then you have this part where you have like you're on a reef and it's kind of just like a big detour, but after that, they get back on the ship and he's like explaining how they're going to get across the cliffs. And he's like, "Oh, well, what you we're going to do is there's going to be an updraft in the cliff, and the boat is going to glide across the cliff." And he's like, we either make it or we don't. He's like, that's why it's called the 50-50 because they have like a 50-50 chance. And they're all like, what? And he's like, too late, get in. And there's a really cool like FMV of them like go launching off. The boat like transforms and they like launch off the edge and they immediately fall. And then the wind picks up and they come back up and go across. It's like super cool.
Yeah, I like this character. I wish he'd stuck around a bit longer than he did. I thought it was going to be, we had an airship or whatever for the rest of the game, and we had this kooky sort of captain there. But yeah, but he was fun while he was there.
Yeah, and it was like a nice lighthearted moment, especially before we get into the next sequence, which is pretty dark.
Yeah.
And I think that this game balances like some of that tone stuff really interestingly and really well. And I think that's a really good example of it. I totally forgot. I knew that happened at some point. I just forgot that it happened here. So that's actually when we crossed the rift, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the events of Garland Village, I think, for me, I think are maybe the strongest sequence in the game. There's some other stuff that I think is really good later, and I really like all the stuff in Serum Kingdom as well. But when you get there, like nobody is nice to Ryudo at all. And for the record, we'll get into why, but I think that their reaction to him is completely unreasonable. Like they're blaming him for something that he didn't do.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's like I kind of understand it because it's like I think it's less that they blame him and more that he reminds them of the tragedy. And so like that is like maybe like a little more understandable than just like cuz obviously like he's not personally responsible, right? But it is kind of like it's very unfair. And Elena picks up on that like immediately, is very angry at everybody cuz she sees it as very unfair the way
Yeah,
they treat him.
it's implied that he sort of abandoned them, and like that's even in its own way, sort of unjustified. But I guess Melphus was the the hero of this town, the great warrior, and then he massively betrayed his community. And then I guess because I guess they maybe were starting to look at Ryudo to come up and save them, and he just didn't. And disappeared. No, it probably isn't explained super well why he just disappeared. I guess he was essentially
Well,
banished.
they said that the chief like says that he was like exiled. Yeah. Um.
right. And he's exiled for something that his brother did. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
just to kind of back up for a second here. Basically, you discover that what happened is so 3 years ago, Melphus and Ryudo, their parents died. They were adopted by the chief of this village, and it's like a warrior village. These are people who specialize in swordcraft. And Melphus was by far, like, of all the people who have ever been in this village, it sounds like the most skilled. It's like sort of like epically powerful as a swordsman. But Ryudo is not too far behind. It seems like Ryudo is also pretty good. And he takes him on eventually. And they grow up there. They have a childhood there, and Melphus is dating or engaged to, I can't remember, the
Yeah.
daughter
He
of the
was
village
engaged to
chief.
her. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the daughter of the village chief. And there's this sword that they think has like some power that can only be wielded by the most powerful swordsman in the village. And Melphus takes it, and then it turns out that we discover sort of over time that this is also a piece of Valmar, where the horns of Valmar, if I'm not mistaken, were
Yeah, they were like sealed. So
embedded.
like the sword is called like the idol, and then horns of Almar are sealed behind it, and then because the day of darkness is like approaching, so there was like a storm, and that was kind of like it's implied that the storm like unsealed the horns of Valmar, and that um actually either that that Sheena, Arena, I think is her name, that she actually was possessed by the horns of Almar, and
I
then they
believe so.
transferred
Yeah.
to Melphis. Yeah,
Yeah.
That sort of isn't evident immediately. Like you see that scene from two different perspectives, a couple of hours apart. Um, but yeah, like your first Melphus's crime is sort of revealed as pure, essentially just murder, like corrupted man, a man corrupted by power that just like destroys this woman, and it's proper, like it's pretty graphic. It's really weird in this game. Everyone's blood is purple. It's not. It's just a decision that's made. And there's just purple blood everywhere all over this scene that they're at. And Ryudo like observes Melphus committing this crime without any context. Like it just comes in and sees him in cold blood murdering, his fiancee and someone they grew up with, and yeah, it's pretty full on.
Yeah, so I think this sequence is really interesting, and especially because like it gives some mystery to Melphus and like whether Melphus, how much Melphus knew what he was doing, how much he didn't. All the history and everything that we know about Melphus suggests that it probably wasn't something that he did consciously, um, but nonetheless, he did take the power and he takes some responsibility for it later as well. Um, so when you're there, it turns out that Melphus is at the top of this mountain where the tragedy happened. And he basically taunts you up there. And then you have to go up there and you have to fight Melphus. In what I think most people consider to be the most challenging fight in this game. This time, that wasn't true for me. But in previous playthroughs, I know that I have really struggled with this fight. But you have to fight Melphus after in Serum Kingdom. We didn't talk about this. He just totally wipes the floor with you. Somehow this time we actually are able to kind of take him to task. But it's a really epic fight. Did you guys struggle with this fight? What did you guys think about all the Melphus stuff?
Yeah, I really like the parts when you're in the town, like leading up to going to fight Melphis. So you have like you can talk to different people and they'll all, basically have different things to say like about Ryudo, and Elena a lot of times will defend him. But you there's like there's a graveyard where all the people who were killed by Melphis are buried, and you can go up and go to each of the graves, and Ryudo will say like
Oh
who was
yeah,
buried there
that's
and
really
talk a little
powerful.
bit about
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I
Which I
missed
think is
that
a
bit.
yeah, yeah, it's a really powerful moment, I think. It's also I don't think we talked about this, but they were all like the town was a town of swordsmen, but since Melphis betrayed them, they've basically given up the sword entirely. So nobody's using swords anymore, nobody's training anymore. And it's like part of it is like I think imply that like their pride is wounded as like a community, but it's also that they're like living in fear and they don't have confidence in themselves anymore. But if you go to the village chief's hut, the you there's like a barrel of swords like on the top level, like in the attic or whatever, and then there's like the pole that leads to that is just there's swords in all of it. And then if you like walk by it, like one of the swords will fall like right in front of you. But I like that little detail because it's like, oh, he took the swords from everyone and they're storing them away, and it's like a visual representation of like the change of the people. I just thought it's like a really cool um like environmental detail.
It is really cool, but I also just want to draw attention to like these weird that the sword falling on you. They're these weird abrupt, like you'd knock into something and it really quickly falls to the ground. There's a lot of these little moments through the game, like you just run across a table. You can't interact with very many parts of the environment, but it's just stuff like that. You just run into a sword or a shield or an item on a table, and it just really crashes to the ground suddenly. It's a weird. They wanted to put some environmental interaction in the game, and they went with that, and that's about all there is to it. Well, other than
Yeah.
you can push boxes occasionally, um, but it sort of scared me when the sword fell down, but it was also slightly comical how
Yeah,
it
yeah,
defied gravity.
absolutely.
I mean, it's like they're trying to play around with like the way that you have dynamic environments in more
Hmm.
recent games, right?
Mhm.
And like they do it in really like specific ways.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's
yeah.
probably because like so many RPGs up to this point were still using pre-rendered backgrounds.
Hmm.
So just the idea that you have this fully polygonal background and you can have like a 3D part of the environment like move like that was probably impressive, I think. And maybe
Oh, I
why
can imagine
that's
it would
in
actually
there.
be interesting at the time, but it stands out as quite unusual.
Yeah, for sure.
So I know this is your first time fighting Melphis, Clayton. How'd you find the fight, and how'd you feel about Melphis in general?
It was a really good fight. I like he's a true villain. Like the uh, the sprite of his face in conversation is like a maniacal laugh or like a absolutely leering kind of dude. So I like that they just went all in and making him this awful person. Um, The fight itself, I definitely had to restart a couple of times. I'm the kind of person that doesn't let it go to like game over. I'll definitely just restart if I've lost the momentum in the battle. Yeah, it was challenging. I still don't think it was as challenging as the Eye of Valmar. I think that was the one I
I think that's
challenged with.
still the hardest fight in the whole game for me, actually.
Yeah, and I
Yeah, I
think at this
agree.
point you're starting to get access to quite a few more like specific skills in battle that allow you to sort of sway the momentum. As long as you're ready to use them, you definitely just can't use combo or critical attacks all the time. You have to start, and I think he debuffs you quite a bit. And this is maybe the first time that you feel that you're losing that grip on the battle through debuff, and you're sort of trying to either rebuff yourself or try and bring his strength down. So yeah, I actually found it good to play around with that side of things more than where the Eye of Valmar was more of like a crowd control situation, and then just putting out damage onto the main. This was like you felt like you were battling with debuffs.
Yeah, he has a his arm is called like the regenerator,
Yeah,
and it will constantly cast buffs on him.
yeah,
And so like I find that targeting that is like first and getting that down is the best way, because if that sticks around too long, he'll just like snowball and power
oh,
too
100%.
much, and then he kind
Yeah.
of becomes hard to deal
It
with.
was just
Yeah.
+5 and a bunch of stuff, and
Yeah.
which it seems to be the cap. I think it's like +5 or -5 is as far as you can go in battle with buff. And it's also you cannot affect the sword with physical attacks, or at least it seemed that
Yes.
you couldn't. And then I maybe had a few other immunities. Yeah, I felt like I didn't get enough time in the battle to actually understand what the interaction between the sword, him, and there's another part of him as well. I think there's three parts. Like this, that is a thing that happens throughout this game with bosses. Like they're very multi-parted, even if they look like a single entity. Um, yeah, there was the regenerator himself, and then maybe the horn was its own thing.
Yeah, I think it's the sword. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's the one that resists physical that you were saying. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, man, I like that it can still be canceled though with physical attacks, and because like for me, like
mm,
I don't know, the way I started playing this game was I ignored all buffs, all debuffs, and I was just like, I'm just gonna try to never let them get a turn. That was always my goal. Um,
It's a good
there's
and
definitely
strategy.
times, yeah, where that can be super successful, but I'm
yeah,
not.
it was hard in
Well,
this fight,
yeah,
for sure. But yeah, I thought it was a fun challenge. But I really like the cutscene that happens afterwards as well, as the horn sort of loses its grip over Melphis. Um, and you sort of he takes some responsibility for what happened here, and I like that. But how much responsibility he really deserves for what Valmar did, I don't know. We do know that you can be strong enough to resist the horns of Valmar, and Elena resists to some degree Millennia. So I think it's really interesting. But my question is, because what happens after he dies is we know that the pieces of Valmar have to go somewhere else, and so Millennia doesn't show up to like absorb them,
Mhm.
and they just go into Ryudo. And like, why? Like, what's she doing? Like, she's watching this whole thing happen. I don't
Yes,
understand.
it's interesting because this is the first boss fight where she well, not I mean, I guess there were those kind of smaller mini bosses that you fight where she doesn't show up, but, like, every major boss fight with a piece of Valmar, but since like, till this point, she shows up. Um, so I think it might be related to, like, the phases of the moon, because that's something that they talk about after this point, and so maybe that's why she doesn't show up right away? I'm not really sure,
it's
but
the moon. There's the moon of Valmar, and it's like casts this red pale across the earth. Is there two moons as well? Like just while we're talking about moons, because it's like they call it the moon of Valmar, or is just the moon of Valmar?
I don't think they ever mention a normal moon
Yeah, yeah.
that I
yeah.
remember. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't
no, I think
remember.
it's just the moon of Valmar, yeah. But I think that might be why she didn't show up. But
At the end
yeah,
of
it
the day,
is
it's just for plot. It's just so they can
right.
That
have
Yeah.
that
you're not wrong.
put a
Yeah.
clock on things and say like we need to help Ryudo now, or he could become corrupted forever, or we'll lose him forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So after the fight with Melphis, as I said, we absorbed the horns of Valmar, which obviously, based on what happened to Melphis, doesn't sound like a great thing. So Ryudo is kind of like, he's in bed, he's unconscious, probably fighting the influence of Valmar during this. And Elena's sitting there, she's worried about him, and she actually calls Millennia out to help, sort of figure out what they're going to do. And Millennia at first is like, oh, well, I guess I'm just going to take the horns of Valmar now. Cool. And then she has a change of heart, and she decides that she's not going to do that, at least at this point, and that she's going to find a way to save Ryudo. And I think that both of the sequences where Ryudo is sort of battling the horns of Valmar are really, really interesting and really well
Mhm.
done. So, what did you guys think about the sequence?
Yeah, it was good to see the vulnerability of it, and I guess start to see Elena accept and try and understand what Millennia's role is between for the group and for herself, and I guess somewhat acknowledge that she has a place in this story and in their lives. Yeah, it was a good passage, I think. The whole
Yeah.
passage from with Melphis and through this part is really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's an important character moment too for Elena because it's like her kind of rejecting the teachings of the church for her own like desires,
Mm,
and out of her own sense of concern for Ryudo, which is, like framed, even though she has a lot of guilt over doing that and calling Melania out later, it is framed as like a good thing. And
mm,
like, that start of her having some more character development where she's willing to break with, what she's been taught, to do what she personally thinks is morally right, rather than what the church teaches is being morally right, which I think is nice, because I think Elena kind of doesn't get quite as amount the amount of development as maybe Ryudo or Millennia. And so it's nice to have her also kind of have these moments where you can see her changing and growing, um, alongside the both of them.
Yeah, I think that as I'm playing through the game, I'm thinking of like Elena and Millennia as like the flip sides of the same coin, right? And I
Mhm.
think that there's something to that as well. Like they're trying to like show like the strength that Elena has in her at the same time, even though the Millennia really is a separate entity. But I think this is the first time where we really get to see, at least on screen, her, instead of her just acknowledging the development of Ryudo, we get to see her developing on her own.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to what the game is doing. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, and it's, I think too, his like internal battle, I think, is really important for like kind of crystallizing what the themes and message of the game kind of are, because it's a lot of him, of Ryudo, like he's like experiencing his past again, that we had heard, when Elena was told about it. And but this time it's like Melphis and Gata, his childhood friend, and are kind of like stand-ins for, like, I think the corrupting influence of Valmar, but also like the idea of like his relationship to power. And it's like him like realizing, like, I'm not pursuing power for its own sake or in service of someone else. I'm pursuing it so that I can bring justice to the world, and then I'm done with it.
mm.
And I think that's a really like powerful moment, because it's like, you know I think that the use and the nature of power, the game like really wants to say something about that here. And I think it does a pretty good job through his kind of internal turmoil.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, up until this point and moving forward in the game, most people who are exposed to this kind of power, there's a lot of power hungry people in the story, and they're almost always corrupted. So, you know, right now, you and Ryudo are kind of thinking, there's a good chance that he's going to take the same path. He's a good swordsman. He's got power in his own right, and now he's been given, he's been implanted with a portion of an evil being. Um, yeah, he could really go the same way as Melphus.
Yeah, and I think that's him having to make that choice is what makes it powerful, right? And so I think that after this happens, Ryudo is awakened, and he's fine. Like the horns of Valmar are buried within him; they're not really a part of him; they're just in there, but sort of buried. That becomes important later
Mhm.
um, for the narrative.
Yeah, I
But
guess they're, like, sealed in him
yeah,
like they were sealed in the areas that they've been sealed around the world or whatever, yeah.
hmm yeah. So after this happens, we have to kind of make our way back, right? Or make our way, continue our way towards the Granite Saber, and the next
Yeah,
place
because
we go.
Melphis tells them where it is.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. I forgot about that. So, you make your way towards, and again, correct my pronunciation here, Nanan Village. Is that right?
that's right.
And this is where Merrig is from. And I'm gonna be honest with you. I remember meeting the people in this area. I remember talking to them. And the only thing I really remember about the sequence is they made me play like this really silly mini game
Yeah.
that then caused me to walk through what I'm guessing was just it seemed just like I don't know, like some like gross tree feces or something.
It's like
Um
catnip or whatever
yeah.
for the
Yeah,
people,
they'd make
yeah.
you walk through it, and then you come back out, and all the people of Merrick's Village are like, "You smell good." I'm like, "This is one of the weirdest things I've done in an RPG in a long time." And I remember literally nothing else that happens in that sequence, so y'all are gonna have to help me with that because I just remember that being real weird. But it was also like funny, and we needed a little bit of again like that tonal balancing and shifting that this game does.
Mhm.
I think this is another spot where it does it well.
Yeah, I think it's like they he tell the chief, like, he frames it as it's going to be like this trial you have to pass, and he's like, only you two can do this for us. And so you think it's going to be like you're going to have to fight or do something. But I think the reason why he like frames it like that is because if they were to go into it, they would like go crazy and like lose their mind. So they can't go into the pit with like the moss or whatever. So that's why they send you. So you you have to be covered in the drugs so they can just get like a little hit of it and not get like overpowered with it. But it's really funny because you're expecting it to be like some like trial or combat scenario or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I even prepared, like I went and got some supplies and things ready to go into a dungeon, and it really wasn't that. I had to get some nuts and feed them to a squirrel, and then get
Yeah.
rice.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
fun that it plays with your expectations in that way though, I
mm,
think.
yeah. But I guess the other than that, in this town, it's really the first time we see a society or like a culture that isn't either with Valmar or with Granis, or
Mhm.
it's sort of like uh, they're a secular society. They don't have a religion. They're about, yeah, the autonomy of humans and sort of people following their own path, forging their own path. Maybe a
Mhm.
little bit of sort of, I guess, destiny, but sort of departed from any sort of god or anything like that. Like a man must make his own story, or a person must make their own story. Um, yeah, so they kind of
Yeah.
say like, why are you so worried about, good and evil, black and white? It's just like, live your own thing.
Yeah, it's interesting too because like it you when you're leading up to the village, you do go to the place where the claws of Valmar were. And that's where Melphis like got, he went there obviously to get the claws of Valmar and take them for his own purposes. But it's like that they were just kind of in the forest, and it doesn't seem like the people of the village were like there as protectors or anything. Like it's just they just happened to be there and they happen to be alongside them. So unlike the other villages, they don't really have any actual like direct connection to that. It's just like happenstance that they were there, which is definitely interesting compared to the other places that we've all been, where they're all really tied in with that piece of Almar or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, even though I didn't remember it very well, I did remember liking the sequence, just because of everything that you guys were talking about there. But we've been talking for a while here, so let's keep chucking along here.
Yeah.
After this is actually what I believe you finally come across the Granite Saber, right?
Yes.
Um, and you see it, and it's like, oh, this isn't just a sword; it's this giant piece of metal that as they say, like, no, like 100 men couldn't possibly carry this. And Tio's like, oh, no problem, just hop in the ship over here. And it turns out to be a piece of technology. But you actually unseal a piece of Valmar while you're there as well, right?
Yes.
So I don't remember the sequence super well, which I feel like I'm saying a lot here, but it's the truth because I played this game a couple weeks ago. Just being honest with listeners here. So what did you guys think about the sequence and sort of how it played out?
It was this was a moment for Tio to sort of develop her character a little bit. They go before they get to the Grandia Saber, they have to deactivate this massive storm that's preventing them from getting through. So they have to go into this dungeon and fight basically a clone
Yes, and
of
you have to
her.
fight Tio. That's a hard fight too, actually,
Yep.
because it's so
Yeah,
fast.
yeah, for sure. So that was interesting, and then that's I suppose as well. You're shown a bit more of this technology. Like there's this machine or like a computer that's basically holding up this storm. It's not a natural occurrence. Yeah, so you go in there, and then yeah, I just think it's super awesome that the Granite Saber is actually a massive spaceship, and then you're shown later that it's actually just one spaceship of many. There's like a whole fleet of these things that just look like awesome swords flying through space and fighting big like cosmic evil. That's I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, it's a very like a Xenoblade Chronicles moment, I think.
100%. Yeah.
Like the Mechonis and Bionis like fighting. You get that sense of like epic scale when you're in there, and it being like different than what you might be expecting in the first place. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think that I really like the moments with Tio. They are it's a reasonable dungeon if I remember correctly, and some of the later game dungeons become less reasonable. Um, so there's a lot this game is juggling at this point, and I think that the Xenoblade reference that you made there, I think, is an appropriate one where you kind of see sort of the scale of technology in this space. After that, though, we try to go on our back to the church at this point, but if I'm not mistaken, we get
That's correct.
sidetracked by Demon's Law and Valmar's body.
Yeah, so you have I mean this is Celine comes back at this point, right? And so she's the one trying to raise the body of Valmar. And then Millennia comes out, and then that's how you get there. Um, and so she kind of take like Millennia kind of takes the lead and is the one that's like leading you through to like the core of the body of Valmar. Um, s-
Yes.
so this is kind of where you're getting like, oh, like the church bad stuff starts to really come in here too.
Right, because you realize that Selene is the one who's actually trying to break the seal on Valmar at this point. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And you like when they say the body of Valma, you're literally in like blood vessels and
Hmm.
like when you first start, it's as if you're in his intestines, and yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
gross.
visually very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it is disgustingly cool. And I don't mean that in like the hip way of saying disgusting. It's literally disgusting. Yeah, I think that if I remember correctly, this is a pretty long dungeon. Um, but I didn't mind going through it because you sort of got all these different pieces and parts of what the body might look like. So I just thought it was visually interesting. Which I thought that the factory we went through right before this was not as interesting. Um, so yeah, I do remember enjoying it though.
Yeah, it's a very cool sequence, and you have this like, there's more development for Tio, like we were talking before, and it also like Marag is like has more of a role. Like now that his like revenge is complete, he's like trying to teach and mentor Tio, which I think is like a nice role for him, especially because coming up, the things quickly take a turn for the worse for him. So it's nice to have those moments, and then um going back to the church um with like the Valmar's moon. After this is when Valmar's moon is like eclipsing the sun. It's like the day of darkness is there. So it's like the stakes for the world have really ramped up now, um compared to where we were before.
we see Selene, like she sacrifices herself. Again, she has purple blood for some reason. She sacrifices a knight, and also reveals that Zera's like sent her here to, like, basically the whole church's bad thing really opens up here. It's not just Selene; it's the whole
Yeah.
shebang.
Yeah,
It's like the
yeah,
villain.
Yeah, and that becomes abundantly clear when we actually bring the Granite Saber back like we were asked to, right?
Mm.
right.
So we actually go back to the church and Zera's like, "Oh, let me show you some things." And then it turns out that Zera had seen like these visions from Valmar and realized that Granis actually lost the fight all those years ago, and Granis is dead, and
Mhm.
Valmar has been split. And Zera decided to sort of take the Church of Granis, and at least I guess it's sort of refreshing that it's mostly just like two people who are like, it's not just like the whole church has been trying to destroy the world. It's just really this one dude. Um, and he, because he gives up his faith in Granis to then try to revive Valmar. And then like what after that sequence happens, and after you're shown that, or maybe it's I can't remember if this happens immediately after, but you have to fight Selene, who we discover was implanted as the heart of Valmar.
Yeah.
Zera is like a super evil dude. Um, and like a comically evil dude, but like in a fascinating way. And my favorite part here is like it almost like tries to do like a little Final Fantasy VI here for a second, where like you guys go to or your party goes to the moon, and Millennia gets pulled in, and even though the horns aren't there, it's enough, and Valmar wins. Valmar is revived, and like the game goes on for a long time, too long in my opinion, after Valmar is revived.
Mm. Yeah, it's just sort of this long sort of Armageddon situation.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's interesting with Zera. I was just thinking about it as we were speaking before. It's kind of like it's still that sort of dogmatic. He probably
Yeah.
grew up in the church. He was taught to behold to like a higher power, and then he
Mhm.
discovered that that higher power is literally dead. Like God is dead. He's not
Right.
coming back. So he's just gone, well, I need to adhere to a higher power. So, Valmar is here. He is alive. He's
Mhm.
powerful. I can get power from him and follow him. And he's just been completely, he's gone down the other path. He could have
Yeah, you
been.
can see the logic of it though, right? Like that. Yeah, it's like, oh well, if the god I thought was dead, well then I have to worship the god that's still around. It
Mm,
like it makes logical sense from his perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the more powerful, and excuse me for getting a little religious philosophical here, but I think it's one of the more powerful criticisms of dogmatic religion, where it's like it has to be real, and it's not about like how you live your life. It's about it has to be
Mhm.
real, and like oh, turns out that's wrong. Well, now I have to go believe this other thing,
yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
no ability for people. For like Elena certainly is guilty of this, and almost every town we go to is has elements of being guilty of this.
Mhm.
They don't have the ability to make choices that are about what matters to them,
Mhm.
and a lot of religious people sometimes kind of lean into that, right? And I think that it ends up making it a pretty powerful message.
Yeah, and it's that worship of like power and authority for its own sake, right? That like it has to there you have there they weren't it's like they weren't attached to Granus because the teachings of Granus were moral and good. It's because he was the powerful being. And so when his absence is revealed, then it's like, well, the powerful being is actually Valmar. So it's like that prioritizing the power and authority and not the actual teaching or like your own sense of morality and then devoting yourself to something because you believe in it. It's more just like that being led by that power that somebody else has or what have you. I think that's a really it's really interesting and kind of ties into how you see people, some people like you guys are saying, interacting with maybe the state or with religion or things like that, like worshiping power and authority for its own sake and not like how it's going to make your life better or what you know how you actually want to live and have the world around you be. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. Um, yeah, and I think that this game sort of ends up being about how you find your space and your way of moving forward within sort of when your god, the only choice of your god is this force of absolute evil and destruction. What do you do? Um, and I think that I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of what that of all the implications of that. Um, but one thing I forgot to mention: when we lose on the moon of Valmar, uh, Merrick is stays behind to save us.
Yeah.
And there's a quick death scene, and people are sort of dealing with the tragedy of that. And I think that's I was actually surprisingly affected by that this time through, um, because even though I think like maybe 20% of what he says doesn't actually make any sense, he's just he really is like sort of the moral compass of this game and of the party and of the
Mhm.
people, and he's like the one person who makes decisions because they matter to him, even if revenge isn't necessarily something that I think is like the best thing to invest yourself in, but it's sort of very existential in that way.
Yeah, and he moves beyond the revenge too,
Hmm.
right? Like
For sure.
in with Tio and everything. And so I think, yeah, he really is like, it's like his sacrifice is that him like that's his like final gift to the party. Like, I've taught you everything I can. Now you need to take my way of life and my philosophy and live it yourself. And yeah, it's a really powerful moment. And he's just such like a genial like and nice character that it is really sad to see him go.
Yeah, and it's helped along that sort of emotional moment's helped along not just by the party but by Tio herself. She's basically pleading with him to come, and she's still got lots to learn. And he basically says, "No, you've got to spread your wings and find your own way."
And I like to again, even though I think the sequence goes on too long, once you get back, like the demons have sort of started to take over, and you get to see the consequence of this one man's sort of desire for power and for what can happen in these situations. And it becomes very, I think, sort of standard JRPG to some degree during this sequence. You go back to Serum Kingdom, you talk to Roan, their kingdom is being attacked, and everything feels pretty hopeless. And I think that, like, I even playing through this time, and I remember certainly the first time, I remember thinking, like, what are we going to do to get past this? And I think that the fact that I knew what the answer was made me a little impatient with them finding the answer to it this time. Um, but I do think that it's a bold move. I hate to evoke Final Fantasy VI, but I do think that there is that sort of this idea like we lost. What does the world look like now? And it actually spends some real time with that.
Yeah, but like you said before, Zach, probably too much time, and it sets up this climactic final battle, and then it spends about 5 or 6 hours culminating towards that. And you basically have to do a bit of a boss rush and just fight basically many of the parts of Valmar over again. And yeah, it becomes very heavy. It's not even town dungeon boss, it's just like dungeon boss dungeon. It lingers a bit too much, and I think
Don't forget the speeches.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh my god, yeah, like
Yeah.
the power of good and the power of friendship and love. And yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's almost like they kind of knew that the game was sort of short, and so it's like, oh well, we have to like really pad out the length of these final moments, and it kind of kills the pacing, in a way. I really don't think like the boss rush part is really that necessary. That to me feels like the most, I think, padded part of the game, really.
Yeah. And because at this point, you're so comfortable. Well, at least I was. You're really comfortable with how you structure a battle and what abilities you use. You pretty much just like use your pop off your most powerful ones you can, and then sort of if there's a crowd, manage the crowd, and then just focus as much damage. Like it just becomes a bit rote, where it like takes
Hmm.
some of the specialness away from that battle system and those boss battles that actually has been really entertaining,
Yeah.
and just sort of makes a big task out of them. So it's a bit of a miss in that regard.
I agree with you. And I think it's one of the things that I felt myself wanting to do as I was going through these final hours and as the battle system got, I thought, a little easy to sort of manipulate, was like I want to go play Grandia Extreme. Which is the first time in my whole life I felt that way. Because the battle system is so good on paper. And I'm curious, Ben, this is a little off topic, but whatever. Um Grandia 3, Grandia Extreme, do they really take the battle system to its sort of logical
Yeah.
strategic endpoint?
Yes, they do. They do. They definitely they add there's more um kind of player agency in the character progression, and the challenges are a lot harder. I think like IGN back in the day famously said like Extreme was like one of the top 10 hardest games on the PS2. And I think that that's pretty accurate. It can be pretty challenging, and you have more characters and stuff to play around with too. So there's a lot of like party building that they add to it. That the elements that don't really work in both of those games are the story and characters are just not as good. But if you're really into the battle system in this game, then I think it's definitely worth playing
Okay.
Extreme and 3 for sure.
Okay. I've got a
Um,
little time before Shadow of the Erdtree. We're recording this before this is going out, so maybe I'll give it a try.
Yeah, I think
yeah,
if they remastered it or something, I would probably give it a go. That was definitely the best part of this game altogether.
Mhm.
Was the battles.
yeah. I think if they did a remaster collection of Extreme and 3, I think that would, and it was like $40 or something, I think it would be worth it.
Mhm.
Maybe each game on their own, it's a harder sell, but together, I think you would get a really, really good one of the best JRPG battle system experiences playing those two. You just
Mhm.
have to know that the other stuff isn't as good going in.
That's fair.
And please
I mean,
put a fast forward on that if you're listening, publisher,
Yeah.
because this game really needed. Just I get so used to having fast forward in remasters now that I was like, how have they not done this?
Yeah, I think the spell effects are
oh my
really what makes
goodness.
it drag. They're
Yes.
Yeah,
so long and
that's
you
right. The
can't
more
skip the
powerful the spell
animation.
is, the more
Mhm.
likely it is to have like a full on like GF sequence.
Yeah.
I like that you called it a GF sequence because it's totally accurate.
It's just how my brain works.
Yeah,
I
and I was
understand.
playing on Dreamcast and I thought every time I did one of those, I thought my Dreamcast is gonna blow up because the disk drive just like goes crazy every time.
I
Yeah,
kind of remember that. Before we wrap up, there are a couple sequences in this final 8 hours, I think it is. Even though we're like really blowing by it, but there's not much to say.
It's just a lot of
Um,
combat and dungeon crawling. And I
yeah,
do think the dungeons are fun and they're really
yeah,
good. It's just not a lot to discuss. Yeah.
yeah.
right. But there is that sequence where Ryudo basically decides, and there's all this hemming and hawing about it, that he has to sort of embrace the power of the Horns of Valmar, um, to be able to take on this challenge. That ultimately isn't everything that goes into it, because it's actually there's something with the gods underneath, something close to Cirrus Kingdom or Serum Kingdom.
Mhm.
I don't even really remember it because it didn't make much sense to me. But I do think that the sequence where you are sort of journeying through Ryudo's psyche, and you get asked this sequence of questions that you have to answer, um, I think is actually really, really strong. And it gets buried in my psyche and memory by all the stuff around it. But I think that sequence is really strong. And I know you liked it too, Ben.
Yeah, yeah, I do. So it's like it's basically like asking you questions about what you're going to use the power for, and like do you want the power for your own selfish reasons, or are you only going to have it for this to complete your mission and help everyone and then be done with that. And so I think it's trying to reinforce that kind of theme of like the responsibility of power, right? And that you shouldn't want power for its own sake. You should only want it to achieve like an end, and then you should be willing to let it go. And that's kind of I think what that sequence really shows, because they keep asking you do you want the power of a god, and you have to say no. You have to say no. That's not what I want. And it's cool. And that every time they focus on Elena and Millennia and Ryudo and their internal struggles and their development, I think that's always the strongest part of the game.
I agree with
um,
that.
yeah.
The only other thing in this section as well, just prior to this, there's a sort of a bit of a reveal of this character Elmo, who's like I don't know, like chief android, and he's the keeper of. It's almost like a computer core where it's as if there's like a master copy of Valmar kept there that can be distributed throughout the planet. Like it reminded me a little bit of like Stargate. I don't know if you guys know that show, or people that are listening know that show. But
Yeah.
like as if this religion was implanted from another planet. It's this sort of like xenotheology um,
Hmm.
that's been put there and then set up to persist after that force is gone. It can and replicate itself and redistribute itself. I mean, it doesn't really go much further than that, but I was really interested by that section because it's something I've really loved in fiction and in science fiction before, like implanted religion from outside. And there's some CGI sections that it shows basically that Valmar and Granis are, as much as they're gods, they're essentially like enormous cosmic beings that just floated into, I don't know, the solar system that this planet resides in, and tried to implant themselves.
Yeah, and I think that like threat of technology thing, it's almost like a Y2K kind of thing. And I think this game came out in Japan in 99. So it's
Mm.
like that, there was a lot of media at that time dealing with that, the threat of technology and what that can mean and maybe evil not being, maybe religious in nature, but it could be alien or technological in nature, and like how do you reckon with that, and I don't know that it's like really fully explored here, but it's just like another thing that they kind of added in there,
Hmm.
and it makes it gives a little more like texture to the world and the lore, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
I mean, I think it gives a little more texture to like this idea that they're worshiping these people. It's not some everlasting, we created the world beings. You know what I mean? So I think that that makes it sort of more interesting in its own way,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah, that's a really good point, Zach. Because then it's also like that there is something without them too, right? Like that it kind of reinforces the idea that these are kind of something that just kind of came along, and so life existed before them and can exist after them too.
Yeah, it's not a creation. It's never presented like the religion isn't a creationist religion. It's like a we existed and then they came and like gave us this meaning and gave us these moral systems. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, especially since it is sort of it's almost a Catholic Church sort of. It's presented like the Catholic Church,
right.
but then to sort of subvert that a little bit and make it slightly different. Yeah, uh, I do like it. I mean, we're never short of theological themes in JRPGs, but I really do like these kind of stories, and I thought it actually did it fairly interestingly. There's a lot of black and white, good and evil, but there's also some nuance to it,
Mhm.
and some mystery still.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think about like the last episode where we kind of talked, oh yeah, like this is kind of a church bad story, but this, playing through these ending segments again, it does, and like you're talking about Clayton, it really does reinforce like how much it's not just that
Hmm.
and how much more they really do with it. And that I think people just maybe don't remember all of these details when they think back on this game, but if you were to
I was
revisit
guilty of that. Yes.
it.
I was like, it's just church bed, right? And I played through. I'm like, oh, there's actually more going on than that. Which is why I think that because I think that the sequence you're talking about there is really interesting, and there are some interesting ideas peppered throughout some really interesting ideas peppered throughout these last 5 6 7 hours, but I do think that they get swallowed by Ryudo just saying like I'm doing this for me,
Mhm.
um and so it's kind of hard for me to sort of square that with the interesting ideas they were doing. But I think that they have just accepted that this can be a 20-hour RPG instead of a 25 or 30-hour RPG. They would have been in much better shape.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it'd be pretty much perfect, I think, at that point, really,
Yeah,
because
Yeah,
it's so strong in all these other ways. Yeah.
yeah,
20 to 25 hours just would be chef's kiss. This would have
yeah.
been. I would have had a much better impression of this game
Hmm.
if it had ended sort of as these revelations came, and then there was just one last boss battle. But unfortunately, it didn't do that.
Hmm. I agree. But I will say that, and then there's the epilogue, which I don't even really want to talk about, which goes on way too long. Uh,
Oh, I like it. I like
I'm
it
glad you like it.
though. What I will say about the epilogue is that you get to go back to each location in the game, like every major town as Rowan, and it really does reinforce like the strengths kind of we talked about last episode, like the almost Trails-esque like detail to the environment and the NPC dialogue. Like you can go back and talk to everybody and see how they're doing, and I like that. I think it makes the world feel more alive and you feel more attachment to it and you see the like the benefits of what you've done, and you get to feel good about that.
Yeah, and it's essentially optional anyway. You could
Hmm.
just turn it off and move on. But yeah, it gives you that little bit of closure, or
Hmm.
shows you that that universe continues on.
Yeah, and you get to see what Millennia is doing with her life now that she's
That part is
free.
delightful. Millennia somehow as a teacher makes total
Yes.
sense to me. Like some of like the best teachers I've ever had, I'm like, or I've known, I'm like, yeah, you got some Millennia energy. I can see it. So yeah, I agree with you. That I forgot about how delightful that part was.
Yeah, and she's got Sky with her too.
Yeah.
Ryudo left Sky with her to keep her in line, which is was wise.
So yeah, I think that overall, and I kind of want to talk about our overall impressions here for a second. Overall, like my impressions of of JRPG of Grandia 2 are very positive, and I kept coming back to something you said in the first episode as I was playing this, Ben, which is like this is sort of the apotheosis of the JRPG. It
Mhm.
sort of is sort of that thing that it encompasses so many things that we look for in a JRPG, with good pacing, with thoughtful storytelling that is theological but also has its own thing to say. That ultimately is about like you make your own choices, and I've played enough Xenoblade games to know that's what JRPGs are about. Um, and I even though the last sequence mars it a bit for me on a variety of fronts, I do think that this game, if I was going to introduce someone to the genre outside of maybe Dragon Quest 11, I think this would be a great entry point, because it's just doing so much of what the genre is. And so I think that it's a great game. It's not perfect. It's not a 95, but it is something that I was happy to spend some time with again.
Yeah, and as a first time player, I think I agree with you. Was surprised how much I enjoyed it. Having had that little play around with Grandia 1, I was a little bit nervous to see what this game would look like and feel like. It was slightly mature. I mean, it wasn't the most mature story. It was dark. Um, it definitely had some bumps. Like I said, I didn't love Ryudo when I first met him, and then I think it's this a pretty stark tonal shift in his character. But yeah, as I said, there's some really interesting elements. I do like these sort of like deep theological stories, and the implication that this like xenotheology, and yeah, I found a lot to like about it. And again, like the battle system, really good. No, I would definitely play this or another game again just to have that experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think I said last time that this is, one of my all-time favorite RPGs of all time, and I think playing it again just really cements that for me, that like it is that um that like platonic ideal of a traditional JRPG for me. And I, playing it again, I just there's so many little details that I caught this time that I didn't catch the first time, and some of the thematic depth and everything that we've been talking about, I think really resonated with me even more on a second playthrough. I'm convinced that like Tetsuya Takahashi must have been at least a little inspired by this game for Xenoblade Chronicles One,
Yeah.
because the Valmar and Granis thing is so similar in some ways to the Mechanis and Bionis and stuff. And I think that this game often gets forgotten about when you're talking about like all-time great classic RPGs. I think part of that's just because it was on the Dreamcast first, and that was kind of a platform not known for its RPGs really, and um, it maybe didn't get the promotion in the West that really should have at the time and stuff. So I'm glad that there's a modern way for people to play it, and I hope more people experience it because I really love it. And I think that there's some depth there, and the battle system is so much fun, and the characters are so great, and I think really anybody who likes the genre would get something out of it.
I agree with that. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to revisit it with the two of you. You guys both brought really interesting things to the conversation. I liked the sort of the expert in the room and then the new person in the room dynamic. So you guys both had really interesting things to say. So thank you both for joining me and for talking about this game for a couple of hours. So let's talk about what's coming up next, since we finished up our conversations about Grandia. So in the month of July, we're going to be playing Dark Souls, which is a game that I just played pretty recently, series, and I've played all of them now. And I'm really excited to hear the thoughts of some newcomers, some veterans on Dark Souls, which is a game that is so important in so many ways. It's so interesting from a game design perspective. So Ben, I believe you're on those episodes,
I
right?
am. I am going to
Okay.
be on those. Yep. I'm
Yeah.
excited too. It's a really formative game for me, so I'm excited
Yeah.
to hear Solosi's thoughts since I know he
Yeah.
hasn't played it before.
Yeah, yeah. I think it'll be an interesting experience for everybody. But I know 2 other episodes we're going to have in July. So I know that there's going to be a PS4 episode about some of our favorite PS4 games. It's going to be sort of a sister podcast to one of our features that should be going up around the same time. And then there's going to be the return of the quiz show. We've had, I believe, at this point, 5 different quiz show episodes, and this might be sort of a capstone to those. That's all I'll say about that. But I'm really looking forward to that, and I'll be participating in that. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us retro@rpgfan.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, Twitch, YouTube. We are usually RPG Fan or RPG Fan.com. You can also find us on Discord. We also have a shop. We have 2 separate shops. One of them is for a collection of RPG Fan review cards published by Hyper Fan or Hyper RPG, I think it is, where you can go and just quickly flip through, see 300 of our reviews sort of boiled down into this really cool graphical, really visually appealing book, and it's really great. But you could also check out some of our stuff from TeePublic, where we have T-shirts, mugs, stickers, all kinds of stuff if you want to rep RPG Fan. We also have 2 other podcasts: Random Encounter, which usually is on every 2 weeks, hosted by John and Logan, about current events and usually whatever people are playing right now. And then Rhythm Encounter, which is about RPG music. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify. If you find podcasts there, we're probably there. We love feedback, especially of the 5-star variety. So before we sign off, I want to let the listeners know where they can get in touch with the panel as well, starting with you, Ben.
Yeah, you can email me at benloganlove@gmail.com.
And Clayton.
Yeah, like as I said, not a big social media person, but I'm still waiting for all those comments on RPG Fan. So set up an account, log in, and it's just scream at me. I don't really care.
Yeah, I think I saw that you made a comment pretty recently. So
Yeah, I was trying to get it
good for
going.
you. Yeah, absolutely. And the best way to get in touch with me is probably email, ZachW@rpgfan.com. You can also find me on our Discord as ZachW. And that's it. That's our playthrough of Grandia II. Hopefully, maybe learn some things about some of the themes of this game. Maybe thoughts about some things. If you haven't played it before, well, I'm not really sure why you're listening to this, but you should go back and give it a shot. I think that it's just a game that moves, and I love games that move. I've lost patience for games that do not. And so thank you, listeners, and thank you, panel. Good night and good luck.